Hello, Web Summit. We're going to look at two things today, but before we get to cold hard cash, let's look at the first bit of the title, increasing content consumption. We're hearing a lot here about the pandemic bump, as it's being called. How has that been reflected for both of you in your businesses?
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, your fan base there. These are a bit less comfy than some of the other stages, I might add. Yeah, I think. Look, Jennifer, we work with lots of brands from different categories, and I think probably the best way to describe it is it's been a very tricky 24 months for a lot of brands, but also businesses too, as we're well aware. And yesterday I was talking about brand purpose. I know this is a slightly different topic, but I think some of the key themes and the issues are just as resonant when it comes to how they connected and communicated to their audiences. And so I think that fundamentally, with so many of us spending so much of our time living our lives through, a 16:9 screen, what we've seen is the emergence of lots of new media environments, and that's created challenges for brands in terms of how they communicate to their audiences, particularly when you think of things like the rise or the increase in use of Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, that only launched during the pandemic, and these closed content ecosystems. How do you advertise to audiences, and how do you get your content to them when those platforms don't take advertising? You've got to start thinking a little bit differently. The hybrid experiences that we were just talking about, hybrid festivals, that some of it happens in real life, some of it happens, virtually, plugged a gap. But now, like this event itself, it's so much better in real life. So how do you re-emerge into that world too? And then I think the new spaces, I'm sure lots of people have heard mention of it or talked about it in meetings over the last couple of days, but not just Facebook going meta, but the metaverse wholesale. That creates a whole new world of opportunity for brands and for audiences too, and managing the way that they connect in those spaces so it feels authentic and genuine is really the challenge going forwards as I see it, and something that we're perhaps going to talk about today.
Yeah, I think on my side, what I've noticed as well, especially with AudioMob and with audio, is we've seen, like, as you said, similar to video, so you see Squid Games with 111 million viewers in its first few weeks of premiering. You see that with, for example, streaming as well. You see, like, Drake's been #1 non-consecutively, but in the charts for like 8 weeks in a row. You see with, like, case studies we've done with music artists, that music consumption is increasing quite heavily. So we've done like a case study with Nas, which meant that he actually ended up going #1 as well, which is really interesting. But we're seeing that, especially with the rise of podcasting and streaming of audio, that is a similar thing across the pandemic. And then when you add what we do, which is bringing audio ads into gaming, and you look at the gaming side, you actually then see even further that gaming is growing in the pandemic 33%. So there's a massive consumption of a very diverse audience, which is not just men. It's 56% women, and there's a massive group of gamer mums as well in there. So you definitely are seeing that gaming has actually become a very mainstream thing for people to do.
But that's interesting, isn't it, your point on gaming, because as you said, not everybody would define themselves as a gamer, even if they are, whether that's, playing Candy Crush or a much more immersive experience. And so understanding that your audience is broader than perhaps you think on the surface is really, really important. And I certainly know with, what you do in your product, it's about moving into those environments, helping advertisers and brands take advantage of them, and gaming as a media channel, but not showing up in a really inauthentic way, being non-interruptive and actually additive to the experience.
And I mean, you mentioned non-interruptive there. Both of you are working with advertising and marketing, but you're not working in traditional advertising, whether it's long-form integration or it's audio adverts. The player has a choice whether to engage or not. It strikes me that it's maybe about meeting the audience and these new audiences where they are rather than talking to them. How do brands go about doing that in an authentic way?
So I definitely think it's key that brands actually understand and grasp this concept, because when you have an increase in content consumption, one of the most important things is you do not want to disrupt and affect that content consumption. So you don't want people to kind of get fed up, get distraught. You wouldn't want a Squid Games where halfway through it, you're interrupted and then there's another ad. So the things about it, what we've noticed is by allowing gamers to game, but also allowing game developers to monetize the game in a way that doesn't interrupt them using audio ads, is actually meant there's an increase in people consuming the content because they don't feel that interruption or they don't feel that irritation that you get if you had a video ad blocking you, for example, for 30 seconds. So I think one of the key elements that brands need to understand is that if you're going to monetize your audience, at least do it in a way that is engaging. Do it in a way that people will actually want to interact with that ad or have a better perception of the brand that's advertising. Because if you're presenting an ad to someone and readily they have that negative prior that you've annoyed me, you've disrupted me, then that's already going to cause a problem in terms of how they feel about the brand that has just been advertised to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. And I think as we were walking to the stage, I sort of heard from the prior panel, they were talking about meaningful connections. And, it might sound overused, but it's absolutely true. And I tend to think that, if you're creating content, you need to do one of three things. You need to, as a brand or as a commercial enterprise, obviously you need to start with your audience and consider what they're into. And as you said, Jennifer, go to where they are rather than sort of drawing them towards you in the old sort of model of advertising. But you've got to think about offering them something of value, and that can be perhaps one of three things. Something that they find entertaining. So, perhaps it's brands moving out of just doing advertising and moving into, brand as advertiser to brand as creator through long form or kind of slightly longer communications products that people want to spend a bit of time with. Information that they might not already know or might enhance whatever it is they're doing in the moment, contextually targeted, relevant information that's useful, and then some form of utility. A lot of the time brands offer utility by virtue of what they do. But for a business that perhaps might not be in that sector, what else can they do? And that might be, upholding sustainability principles, for example, that they've committed to, but then actually putting their money or their brand where their mouth is and doing something about it.
You mentioned sustainability there. I mean, it's been one of the themes of this conference, along with corporate responsibility and themes of activism. How do brands do that in a way that is authentic while still having an eye on the bottom line? Because we've seen a lot of performative action from brands over the last 18 months, but perhaps the way that translates into actual action and systemic change has been somewhat further behind the curve.
Yeah. So yeah. I definitely agree with you in terms of brands are realizing, especially with Gen Z, that they have to be more responsible, which is really a positive thing actually. And one thing that we've done, we've tried to get away from this idea of just impressions, clicks as the engagement metric that everyone loves to use. But now we're looking at stuff like insights tools. So, for example, being able to ask the customer after you present them an ad what their thoughts, what their sentiments towards that brand is, or, for example, what they allowing brands to do stuff around, like let's say you want to learn if your customers would purchase your product if it was more sustainable, or if you are a chocolate brand and you want to know if it was more fair trade, and you can do that with using like insight surveys. So what that allows you to actually gather is the sentiment now of what actually people think of your brand rather than just clicks and saying it's engagement. When we know people are clicking by accident, we also know people aren't as engaged with those particular brands as well.
I mean, someone cleverer than me, I think somebody said, doing good is good for business, right? And I think that's the way to think about sustainability and ESG, from a governance and everything perspective. And I think probably the best approach is or the best way to think about it is commercial endeavors and sustainability and doing good for the planet don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can be beneficial to both consumers and obviously to the commercial enterprise itself. And maybe as an example, let's take the travel industry, right, who've been probably one of the hardest hit sectors of the pandemic. People couldn't travel. It's great we can come to Lisbon now. So they naturally want to get people moving again, whether you're an airline or whether you're a hotel business. So thinking about how you can start to move your consumer base to sustainable travel by offering them perhaps filters to select their sustainable journey. And in doing so, you're still generating revenue. You're still kind of, filling the kind of the P&L up with some money and generating profit. But you're also giving your consumers choice. and you're monetizing, I guess, the content that you create. Perhaps it's making them more aware of the impact that as a traveller you might be having on the location you're going to, and the things that you should do when you're there, or not do rather, so you leave a kind of net zero impact. I think they can work fluidly together, but there's definitely been a case of brands doing far too much virtue signalling and saying, oh, we're all about this, we're all about that, we're all about all of it. And I think you kind of got to go for one thing and commit to it properly, and then live that for the next 5-10 years, not just to kind of put a press release out and then forget about it.
And both of you are helping brands do that in terms of reaching consumers and getting the message to them. But how much responsibility do you take as advertising facilitators to make sure that brands are doing that, that they are sticking to what they say they're doing in terms of corporate responsibility? Because it's a very hard thing to regulate when it comes to these sorts of issues.
So I think that's a very interesting topic. So I think as a advertising platform, you have to strike a fine balance of also what is legal in certain regions and jurisdictions and what isn't legal in others. So what we tend to do is we look at a number of factors around how the company has actually acted through a period of time. Have they done corrective action, for example? Then we also look at like legalities as well. Like, for example, things that might be legal in certain states in America but not legal in Europe, or certain countries in Europe. And then it's actually balancing those all up, and then actually seeing, for example, if there was an issue, maybe they have done corrective action, and talking with the client around that. And also then in terms of creatives, if we're talking about the actual messaging of the creative, is also working with the client to let them understand how they can be more engaging, how they can be more interesting in terms of their creatives, but also careful with the messaging and then not spreading false information. So they have those, for example, messages afterwards which clarify certain points of the ad, or you can click through and then there's extra information around what exactly they are advertising and the terms and conditions.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it carries through to the whole production cycle, right? You don't have to fly halfway around the world to shoot a commercial or a piece of content these days. I mean, you do if that's key to it, but when you think about, and this is actually areas that I think the metaverse, however you define it, does start to open up. When you think about companies like Epic Games that make Fortnite, they also make a gaming engine called Unreal that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And for any Star Wars fans like me who've watched The Mandalorian, you'll probably know that they shot most of that in a kind of virtual stage, using Unreal Engine as the kind of graphics engine in the background to create in real time, photoreal backgrounds that would cost a fortune to go and shoot, but also rack up the carbon footprint and the carbon miles. So actually technology and the blending of the virtual world with the real is starting to and will definitely create more sustainable production practices. And the second point, Jennifer, is that for a business like ours, and for a product offer that you have, Wilfrid, too, we're being held to account by the advertisers and the brands that we represent. So they are saying, well, tell me what your kind of ESG policy is, but also your sustainable value chain from the people that you work with to the product that you put out. So there's going to be even more emphasis, not just on businesses like ours, but on all businesses to do this. Let's see what comes out of COP26 too. But it's not something that you need to do it now, right? And you can't sort of ignore it and stick it in the corner, because it will affect your ability to make money from whatever content it is that you create in the long run.
I mean, you mentioned the metaverse there. It's definitely the buzzword of this week. We're seeing a lot of people very enthusiastic about it and a lot of people really quite cynical about it. What does the metaverse present to you in the way of opportunities? What do you see it as being in an ideal world?
So I think the metaverse, it can become quite a confusing phrase because you see it used in different ways. I think to me what the metaverse basically encapsulates is two ideas. Gaming, which has become huge. We see Roblox, you see Fortnite, you see over 20 million people coming to watch a Travis Scott concert virtually. But then it also encapsulates this idea of us all having to work from home. And glad we're all here today, which is great, but all having to work virtually. So I think it's trying to encapsulate those two ideas in a way of us kind of connecting and also communicating with one another in this virtual world. I don't see it as taking over the primary function of human interaction. What I do see it as is something that we can drop in and out of, and something that people will go to for experiences. Some people, like, for example, what we've seen with Fortnite, what we've seen with Roblox. and people to kind of unwind, but also maybe engage as well. But I don't see it as the be and end all of everything. And then in terms of opportunities I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we're seeing them already. Like, you see the music industry, we've had Marshmello, we've had Travis Scott, we've had Ariana Grande all in Fortnite.
And Lil Nas X in Roblox.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also have all of the custom. I find Fortnite fascinating because none of the things you buy actually affect the gameplay. So it's all about customizing your character. So it's really interesting in terms of, from an advertising point of view, of how people are monetizing that is by the customization, that human element of people want to express themselves in different ways. And then there's obviously opportunities there for also audio and not interrupting people there as well in terms of what billboards and going into certain areas of the gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not necessarily sure it's really a new concept. It's just got a bit of a new buzzword. You know, in a previous life, I worked for PlayStation, and when we launched PlayStation 3 many years ago, the product launched with a thing called PlayStation Home, which was effectively like a 3D environment, avatar-based, where you could kind of come together and interact. It was a little bit ahead of its time, I think, and ultimately it didn't work out. But I think probably at its best, what it will be is, yes, the merging of the real and the virtual world. It will be enabling of things that we perhaps haven't yet defined. And, you know, like any form of technology, it kind of needs to be like oxygen in the sense that it's invisible, but absolutely essential to, you know, how we live our lives. And what I also find is people are defining it in so many different ways right now. It's just sort of been thrown out there. We'll be figuring this out for a few years yet.
So in terms of moving, you both mentioned moving away from intrusive advertising, but is the future of advertising a more immersive experience within that metaverse?
So I would definitely say yes to that question, because I think one thing that's really clear, and I think everyone in the audience will probably agree with, is people do not like the idea of hyper-targeted ads, right? You don't really want to be looking at Jordans or looking or Fenty makeup, and then the next day you are getting continuously targeted with those adverts. So I think one thing we've realized is that they need to be more immersive. They need to be in a way that, yes, we're not saying that everyone's going to particularly maybe enjoy all of them, but what we are saying is that for people to enjoy free experiences and to make things more accessible, you need some form of advertising, so that, because some people can't afford the subscriptions, especially in the developing world. So you need some way to kind of have that equality across the spectrum. And a way of doing that is, I think it will be immersive ads, but ones that are also privacy first. So ones that are focusing on not using this hyper-targeted information and using less information. So that's something we do at AudioMob. We're using contextual targeting. So rather than using like very defined, hyper-localized, like you're lat long and you're right next to this cafe, we're using stuff like top-level data to then advertise to people.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with all of that. I think advertising is there to persuade people to engage with stuff, not always to buy, but to, you know, at its best, change behaviours and have a positive influence and lasting effect. And, you know, long may that side of it continue. What I do think is perhaps, not the metaverse necessarily, but perhaps what we've just been through for the last 18 months to 24 months, and hopefully, you know, this is kind of the end of it. Adopting new models to create stuff and thinking specifically about brands creating perhaps longer form entertainment, you know, that might represent an opportunity for brands to offset their marketing investment by monetizing the back end. You create a property, you create some intellectual property, and then you're able to distribute that through broadcasters and other networks, for example, and you take a share of the, or take all, you know, if you own the whole thing, of the revenue from the IP. It's a nice way to create a cyclical cycle where you're selling your products and you're advertising your wares. You're doing it perhaps through some, like an entertainment vehicle, and you make money in the back end that offsets the marketing investment in the first place.
Seems like a very good place to call time. Thank you very much, Wilfrid and Luke.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.